Okay. I sent you the link about the Ishiba, the Japanese Prime Minister was talking about Asia-Pacific NATO. What is your view on that? Why does Japan wants to have an Asian Pacific NATO?
Well, I think it's a crazy idea. By the way, it's been tried before. In the 60s, there was an Asia Pacific NATO called SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. It collapsed in the 1970s, just saying. This would
Okay.
collapse as well. All that would end up happening is we would have all the same countries that are currently allies of the
Uh,
United States, even more closely connected. Japan, Australia,
mhm.
New Zealand. It'd be all the same group of countries that we all know about. They'd be even more closely tied to the US than they are already. There'd be even more mechanisms for the US to interfere in their internal affairs. They would be tied to the United States in the same way that Germany and Britain are, and unable to make their own decisions in their own national interests. And it's a very, very bad idea indeed. And it won't increase the security of the
Mhm.
Japanese people. It will reduce it because it will freeze hostility between Japan and China,
Mhm.
which does not serve Japan's interests.
Mhm.
And all to what end?
Yeah.
To prolong a little longer this position that the United States believes it is entitled to in the world,
Yeah,
which
and then
cannot be of interest to Japan.
the Chinese media, I later read that actually both India and Indonesia not happy with this. They said we're not interested in this to
No.
have an Asia Pacific NATO. Indonesia, to the degree they even told Japan, the Ishiba himself, saying, "Do not bring this up in the upcoming ASEA summit, which is ongoing. I think it just started
Yeah.
today." So that just tells you the sentiment in Asia about
Yeah.
this. But here's what the Chinese media take, lots of discussion about this is that in a lot of ways, Japan and Britain is very similar. They're island country. And just the way that sometimes you see Britain want to see continental Europe in chaos, Japan want to see chaos. That's
Yeah.
how the Chinese see them. Of course, Japan wants to see, ultimately, Japan actually would really want to see China and US to have a direct confrontation. They
Mm.
believe they serve the Japan best.
Yeah.
But since none of the China or US really that interested in this, at least not now, I mean, they're too
Mm.
smart for that. So the Japan trying to get some kind of a proxy going. Now, if you want to
Well,
proxy, having a Asian Pacific NATO probably is a good way to start a proxy because then you irritates China, right? Then you cross China's red line or what have you.
mm.
Is that what is going on?
Well, I think so. I mean, I think it's a good point that the parallel that you make between Britain and Japan. I mean, we discussed it in our previous
Yeah.
program. But one of the reasons the British are major supporters of NATO and and so keen on this alliance that they have with the United States is because Britain, which is a far less powerful country than it was, tries to leverage its close alliance with the United States to gain influence in Europe.
Mm.
So they think that they can ride American coattails and still be important in Europe. And I think that there is an element in Japan that thinks the same thing. That Japan, we'll come to Indonesia in a moment. But Japan hankers for some major role in the Pacific. It tried, of course, to achieve that before with
Yeah.
Southeast, with there was it East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere or whatever it was called, and well, we all know what the result was. So it's not able to do it by itself, as it knows. So it wants to get the Americans on side,
Yeah. Yeah.
tighten this alliance. This is, I don't mean all Japanese think like this, but the
No, no.
Japanese section of the Japanese elite think like this. And, tighten this American alliance and then use that to expand Japanese influence across Asia. And of course, it's a completely counterproductive strategy. I mean, it's been disastrous for Britain, by the way. I'm not going to discuss this at length, but it means that the British have not addressed their own domestic problems. They cling on to illusions of power, which it would have been far better if they'd been done away with long ago. In the case of Japan, it's of course even more dangerous because countries across Asia remember very well the last attempt Japan made to try to expand its influence across Asia. And of course, India was almost invaded by Japan in the 1940s, and that is still a memory there. Indonesia was occupied by Japan in the 1940s, and it was a very brutal and cruel occupation, as anybody who is familiar with that time knows. And they absolutely do not want to be in that kind of situation again, with the Japanese returning through the Americans, establishing themselves in all these places and trying to run things there. So Indonesia, of course, is going to say no, and other countries too.
Yeah. And the ASEA summit, it just started, right? That other than the ASEA country, there are 10 of them, right? So it's interesting. Yeah. There is seems way more than just ASEA country, because during this meeting, they also have the so-called 10+1, which is ASEA China, 10+3, ASEA plus China, Russia, the South Korea, and Japan. And then also East Asia Summit, which is China, Japan, South Korea meeting. So there's plenty of meetings. And on top of that, so I think US, Russia, Australia, of course, China, India, New Zealand, whole bunch of countries send their representatives there.
Yeah.
What do you take on that? This is a gigantic meeting, seems like. A lot of meetings to get together. What are they doing?
It is a gigantic meeting, and you can see that these countries do not, these countries at the core of this, they do not want to be pushed into a position where they are being asked to take sides or form blocks. So they say, we want to talk with everybody. We don't want to exclude you. We want everybody here. But of course, China's happy with that. Russia's happy with that. The Americans are not happy with it. And that is the fundamental problem. Now, these countries are economically developing very fast. I've just been to Malaysia, as you know. Again, you spend any time in a country like Malaysia, you cannot fail to notice the huge presence of China. It's strange to say this because geographically China isn't, it's not a neighbor exactly, and but I mean it is the region. There are many Chinese people in Malaysia. There is certainly no sentiment in Malaysia that I could see that people wanted to be hostile to China. And of course, the people in all of these places, they have millennial history of close relations with China, and they will want to preserve that. And of course, they go ahead, they have these huge meetings. They want to establish trade links. Some of them have very close relations with other countries. Vietnam, for example, has very close relations with Russia, going back to the 50s and 60s and to the period of the Vietnam Wars. Indonesia, by the way, as its new president-elect pointed out, he's also been to Russia recently, met with Putin. He reminded everybody that, again, in the 1960s, Russia and Indonesia had very close relations, as Indonesia and China at that time also did. So they want to keep their relations both with their old friends, called China and Russia, and also at the same time to keep a good relationship with China. It is existentially important to them. Vietnam, which is always the country that always gets talked about because there's, there's issues about islands. They don't want to get into a confrontation with China over those islands. I mean, they are far too familiar with their own history and understanding of their position and understanding of what China is to think that this can be of any possible advantage to them. So, of course, they call everybody together. I'll tell you something, the Americans will not be happy that the Chinese are there. Of course not. They'll be absolutely furious that the Russians are.
Yeah, I was surprised. It see so many countries. India was there.
Yeah,
Everybody's
yeah,
there, even though it's called
yeah,
ASEA Summit. And then one interesting thing is last year, it was in Indonesia. This year is in
yeah,
Laos. Now,
yeah,
Indonesia, when the host country, so they wanted to, of course, have a joint statement. They were struggle for a while to
yeah,
have a joint statement because they couldn't agree on the wording about the Ukraine war. My
yeah,
understanding. My guess is it must be the US who put a lot of pressure last year. Now,
yeah,
this year, the war is still going on in Ukraine, and of course, the situation in the Middle East, like the Lebanon Israeli conflict and the Gaza situation in general. Remember, Indonesia and Malaysia, these are big Muslim countries. They
yeah.
cannot be particularly happy to see what's going on there. So it will be interesting to see what kind of wording they would, because that's one topic they discuss now. What do you think? You think
No,
their
well, I can speak about this. I was in Malaysia. It is a Muslim country, and they are concerned about it.
yeah.
You're not going to find any people who are very sympathetic to the US in Malaysia at this time.
Uh-huh.
Even people, by the way, who are not Muslims,
Okay.
because I mean, they understand how upset people feel. So, absolutely, I mean, one of the effects of the events in the Middle East is that it's affected American international prestige. And
Hmm.
on Ukraine, it's the same. I mean, I think initially a lot of countries weren't able to make their minds up about Ukraine. That their instinct was that they don't like a war being fought in Ukraine, especially if it appears to be over territory. This isn't something that most countries around the world want to see. But I think they've gradually come round to understanding who's prolonging this war.
Yeah.